James Wilson sat in the quiet of his dressing room, staring at his reflection in the mirror. At 82, the lines on his face told stories of a lifetime in Hollywood. From his early days as a rugged action star to his later years as an acclaimed director. He ran his weathered hand through his silver hair and sighed deeply. 10 minutes, Mr. Wilson, called a young production assistant through the door. James nodded to himself. He hadn't wanted to do this show. The evening spotlight with Alexandra Reed was known for ambushing guests, especially those with conservative leanings. His publicist had insisted it would help promote his new film, a drama about American small-town values that critics were already labeling as too traditional and out of touch. It's just an interview about the movie, his publicist had promised over the phone. Alexandra's team gave their word they'll stick to questions about your directorial choices and the themes of rural America. James knew better. He'd been in this business long enough to recognize when he was being set up. But he'd never been one to back down from a fight even at his age. He picked up the photo on the dressing table, himself as a young man standing beside John Wayne on a film set in the 60s. Those were different times in Hollywood. People could disagree politically and still respect each other, still work together and create art that spoke to everyone. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "We're ready for you, Mr. Wilson," said the production assistant, a nervous-looking young man with thick-rimmed glasses. James stood up slowly, his knees protesting slightly. "Let's get this over with," he muttered, buttoning his navy blazer. The walk to the stage felt longer than usual. As he approached, he could hear the excited murmur of the studio audience. They were expecting fireworks tonight. Alexandra Reed had built her career on creating viral moments at the expense of her guests, especially those who didn't share her political views. From the wings, James watched as Alexandra warmed up the crowd. She was good at her job, beautiful, articulate, and charismatic in a sharp red dress and perfectly styled hair. The audience hung on her every word as she made jokes about the current political climate, carefully crafted to appeal to her predominantly liberal viewers. And now, Alexandra announced with a dazzling smile, "Please welcome legendary actor and director James Wilson." The applause was polite but reserved as James walked onto the stage. He noticed several audience members whispering to each other, some with smirks on their faces. He'd seen that look before. People who had already decided who he was before he'd said a word. "James Wilson," Alexandra exclaimed, air kissing his cheek as he took a seat in the plush armchair across from her. "What an honor to have you on our show. I loved your early westerns growing up. My dad was a huge fan." "Thank you," James replied simply, settling into the chair. He wasn't one for small talk. "So," Alexandra began, crossing her legs and leaning forward with practiced interest, "your new film American Heartland opens next week. What inspired you to tell this particular story?" James relaxed slightly. Maybe this would actually be about the film after all. "I've always been drawn to stories about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges," he said, his voice deep and measured. "This film is about a farming community in Nebraska dealing with economic hardship and family struggles. It's about resilience and the bonds that hold people together when times get tough." Alexandra nodded, her smile never wavering. "And some critics have suggested it paints a rather idealized picture of rural America, that it ignores the realities of modern life in these communities. Issues like opioid addiction, poverty, racial tensions." And there it was, the pivot he'd been expecting. "The film doesn't ignore those issues," James responded calmly. "But it's not defined by them either. Real people are complex. Their lives aren't just collections of social problems for urban audiences to feel sorry about." A slight murmur rippled through the audience. Alexandra's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course," she said smoothly. "But speaking of representation, I couldn't help but notice the cast is predominantly white. Was that a conscious choice?" James felt his jaw tighten but kept his expression neutral. "The film is set in a specific community in rural Nebraska. The casting reflects the demographic reality of that particular place, just as a film set in other parts of America would reflect different demographics." The camera zoomed in on James's face, looking for any sign of discomfort or anger. But decades in front of cameras had taught him how to maintain his composure. Alexandra pressed on. Let's talk about your comments last year at the Directors Guild dinner. You mentioned that Hollywood has become, and I quote, too concerned with checking boxes rather than telling good stories. Many found those remarks offensive. Would you like to clarify what you meant? The audience leaned forward expectantly. This was what they'd come for. The trap had been set, and they were waiting for James to fall into it. James took a slow breath. He glanced past the bright studio, lights to the faces watching him. Some eager for controversy, others already judging him based on headlines they'd read online. He thought about declining to answer, about steering the conversation back to his film, but something in him rebelled against that idea. You know, he said slowly, when I first came to Hollywood in the 60s, I was just a young man from Oakland trying to make it as an actor. I had nothing but the clothes on my back and a few dollars in my pocket. I slept in my car for months, took any job I could get, ate one meal a day sometimes. The audience was silent now, not sure where this was going. I've seen this town change a lot over the years, James continued. Some changes for the better, some not so much. But one thing that's been lost is the ability to just talk to each other, really talk, without assuming the worst about people who see things differently. Alexandra shifted in her seat, clearly trying to regain control of the interview. That's an interesting perspective, but I'm not finished, James said quietly, his voice somehow filling the studio despite its softness. The interruption wasn't rude, but it was firm enough that Alexandra fell silent, surprised by the gentle authority in his voice. The cameras caught everything. The momentary confusion on Alexandra's face, the absolute stillness that had fallen over the audience, and the calm determination in James's eyes as he poor Alexandra's perfectly manicured nails dug slightly into the armrest of her chair. This wasn't how interviews on The Evening Spotlight typically unfolded. She was known for maintaining control, for pushing her guests into corners where they either made newsworthy gaffes or apologized for past statements. James Wilson wasn't following the script. You promised questions about my film, James said, his voice calm but carrying a hint of disappointment. Instead, you're trying to create a moment at my expense. A few uncomfortable coughs came from the audience. The production assistant standing off camera widened his eyes and made a subtle, cutting motion with his hand, signaling Alexandra to move on, but she ignored him. I'm simply asking questions that our viewers are interested in, Alexandra replied smoothly, recovering her composure. Your film touches on political themes, and your past comments have certainly stirred controversy. Don't you think public figures should be held accountable for their statements? The studio lights felt especially hot tonight. James loosened his collar slightly, taking his time before responding. The producers wouldn't dare cut his microphone. That would create exactly the kind of controversy they couldn't afford with someone of his stature. Accountability, James repeated thoughtfully. That's an interesting word. But it seems like what passes for accountability these days is really just public shaming. I've been in this business for over 5 decades. I've worked with people from every background, every political belief. We didn't always agree, but we respected each other enough to listen. Alexandra's smile remained fixed in place, but her eyes had hardened. With respect, Mr. Wilson, many would argue that some views shouldn't be tolerated in a modern, inclusive society. The camera panned across the audience, capturing their reactions. Many nodded in agreement with Alexandra. Others looked uncomfortable, sensing the tension building on stage. I've lived long enough to see the same mistakes repeated by different generations, James continued. When we stop listening to each other, when we decide some people aren't worth talking to because their views offend us, that's when society starts to fracture. He leaned forward slightly, his weathered hands clasped together. You asked about my film. It's about a farming community where a progressive city lawyer moves in after inheriting his uncle's property. He arrives with all sorts of assumptions about the locals, that they're backwards, ignorant, prejudiced. By the end, he realizes they're just people trying their best, same as him. Different ideas maybe, but the same hopes and struggles. That sounds rather simplistic, Alexandra countered. Real-world divisions aren't solved so easily. Don't you think your film might be promoting a false sense of unity when we should be addressing systemic problems? A slight murmur ran through the audience. The production team in the control room watched the monitors nervously. This interview was veering into dangerous territory, not controversial enough to go viral, but too confrontational to feel comfortable. We've done 3 minutes on this topic, the director said into Alexandra's earpiece. Pivot to questions about his directing style. Alexandra ignored the direction. She sensed something brewing, a potential moment that could define this episode. James Wilson rarely gave interviews and never showed emotion publicly. If she could just push a little harder, your generation had its chance to address these problems, she said, her voice taking on an edge. Many young people today feel they inherited a broken system. Wouldn't you agree that new voices deserve to be heard without being lectured about civility by those who benefited from the status quo? A pin drop could have been heard in the studio. The camera operator zoomed in on James's face, expecting to capture either anger or discomfort. Instead, they found something unexpected. A look of genuine sadness. I grew up poor, James said quietly. My father left when I was young. My mother worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table. I dug swimming pools and worked as a lumberjack before I ever stepped in front of a camera. Nothing was handed to me. He paused, looking directly at Alexandra. But you're right about one thing. Young people deserve to be heard. Every generation does. The problem comes when we stop seeing each other as individuals and start seeing each other as categories. Liberal, conservative, old, young, this race or that one. Alexandra opened her mouth to interrupt, but something in James's steady gaze made her hesitate. In my new film, he continued, there's a scene where the lawyer and a local farmer end up stranded together during a storm. They spend the night talking, really talking, and discover they have more in common than they thought. Not because their political views changed, but because they started seeing each other as human beings first. The audience was completely silent now, hanging on every word. This wasn't the confrontation they'd expected, but somehow it was more compelling. Your questions tonight, James said, his voice still gentle but firm. They weren't really questions, at all. They were attempts to put me in a box, the cranky old conservative who doesn't understand modern values. But people are more complicated than that. I've voted for candidates from both parties in my lifetime. I have changed my mind on issues as I've grown and learned. Haven't you? Alexandra was momentarily speechless, a rarity for the veteran host. The question wasn't aggressive, but it had caught her off guard. The cameras captured her brief but noticeable hesitation. We all evolve in our thinking, she finally managed, trying to regain her footing. But surely you understand why some of your previous statements have upset people? James nodded slowly. I'm not perfect. I've said things I regret, like everyone else. But there's a difference between holding someone accountable and trying to destroy them for having the wrong opinion. He gestured toward the audience. Look at these people. They came here tonight expecting to see you take down the old Hollywood conservative. It's entertainment now, watching someone get publicly shamed. But what does that accomplish? Does it change minds? Does it make the world better? Several audience members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others looked thoughtful, as if considering his words. We've become so focused on catching each other saying the wrong thing that we've forgotten how to listen, James continued. In my day, I worked with people across the political spectrum. We argued, sure, sometimes fiercely, but at the end of the day, we still respected each other as people. Alexandra glanced at her notes, clearly trying to find a way to wrest control of the conversation back. The director was frantically speaking in her earpiece, reminding her they needed to go to commercial break soon. That's a lovely sentiment, she said, her professional smile returning. But some would say that's a privileged position to take. For many marginalized communities, these aren't abstract debates but matters of basic rights and dignity. James nodded. You're absolutely right, and those voices deserve to be heard. But shutting down anyone who doesn't immediately agree with you isn't progress. It's just a different kind of silencing. The red light on the main camera began blinking, signaling 1 minute until the commercial break. Alexandra saw her opportunity. To reframe the segment, "We'll have more with director James Wilson after the break," she said, turning toward the camera with her practiced smile. "We'll discuss his directing process and his experiences working with the cast of American Heartland. Stay with us." As the applause sign lit up and the theme music began playing, Alexandra leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. This interview wasn't going as planned. Instead of catching James in a controversial statement, she was finding herself on the defensive. James sat quietly, taking a sip from the water glass on the small table beside him. He hadn't raised his voice once, hadn't shown anger or frustration. But somehow, he had shifted the dynamic of the entire interview. The crew members, exchanging glances behind the cameras, sensed it. The audience members whispering to each other felt it. Even Alexandra, with all her experience, knew that something unexpected was happening on her stage tonight. And they were only halfway through the interview, paired to co. The commercial break couldn't come soon enough for Alexandra. As soon as the on-air light went dark, she yanked out her earpiece. "What is happening out there?" demanded Robert, the show's executive producer, rushing onto the stage. His face was flushed with a mix of concern and excitement. "This isn't what we planned, but the social media team says mentions of the show are exploding online. People are actually tuning in live to see what happens next." Alexandra took a quick sip from her water bottle. "He's not taking the bait. I'm throwing him every loaded question in the book and he's just..." She gestured vaguely, being reasonable. "It's infuriating." Across the stage, James sat calmly in his chair, declining the offer of touch-up makeup from a hovering stylist. Instead, he pulled out a small leather-bound notebook from his jacket pocket and jotted something down. "What's he writing?" Alexandra whispered to Robert. "Who knows? Listen, change of plans. The viewers are responding to this, whatever this is. Don't try to corner him anymore. Have a real conversation. People are saying this is the most authentic interview they've seen in years." Alexandra's eyes widened. "You want me to just let him lecture me about the good old days for another 20 minutes? Robert checked his phone again, scrolling through the live social media feedback. "The audience doesn't see him lecturing you. They see him cutting through the usual talk show nonsense. Just talk to him. For real." 2 minutes, called the floor director. Robert squeezed Alexandra's shoulder and hurried back to the control room. She took a deep breath, inserted her earpiece again, and tried to collect her thoughts. This was not how her interviews usually went. She prided herself on maintaining control, on knowing exactly where each segment was heading. James tucked his notebook away and straightened in his chair. Their eyes met across the stage, and to Alexandra's surprise, he gave her a small, almost sympathetic smile. It wasn't condescending or smug, just human. Something shifted in her approach. Maybe Robert was right. 30 seconds. Alexandra adjusted her posture, mentally revising her next line of questioning. The makeup artist did one last powder touch to her forehead and scurried off stage. "And we're back in 5, 4, 3. The floor director silently counted down the final 2 numbers. The on-air light glowed red once more. The camera panned across the audience before settling on Alexandra's professional smile. "Welcome back to the evening spotlight. I'm here with legendary actor and director James Wilson, whose new film American Heartland opens next week." She turned toward James with a slightly softer expression than before. "Mr. Wilson, before the break, we were discussing some of the broader themes in your work. I'm curious, what do you think has been lost in our public discourse that your generation did better?" It wasn't exactly a friendly question, but it wasn't a trap either. James seemed to recognize the subtle shift. "That's a thoughtful question," he said, nodding slightly. "I don't think any generation has all the answers. Mine certainly didn't. We had the Vietnam War, civil rights battles, assassinations of beloved leaders. The country felt like it was tearing itself apart then too." He paused, gathering his thoughts. The audience was still silent, but it was a different kind of silence now, attentive rather than anticipatory. "What I think we did have," James continued, was more shared experiences. Most people got their news from the same 3 networks. We all watched the same shows, listened to the same radio stations. For better or worse, there was more of a common narrative. Alexandra found herself genuinely interested in his perspective. But wasn't that common narrative often excluding many voices? Women, minorities, the LGBTQ community? Absolutely, James agreed without hesitation. And the push to include those voices has been vital and necessary. I've supported that progress throughout my career. What concerns me isn't the inclusion of new voices. It's the way we've all retreated into our separate corners, only listening to people who already agree with us. A woman in the 3rd row nodded visibly. James noticed and gave her a small acknowledging nod before continuing. In my film, there's a town hall scene where people with completely different worldviews actually stand to each other. Not because they're saints, but because they live in the same small town. They can't just block each other and move on. They have to find a way forward together. Is that realistic in today's America? Alexandra asked. The divisions seem deeper than ever. James leaned forward slightly. I think it has to be realistic or we're in real trouble. Look, I've been called every name in the book because I don't fit neatly into either political camp. I believe in personal responsibility and the Second Amendment. I also believe in environmental protection and have supported progressive social causes for decades. He gestured to the audience. I bet everyone sitting here has some mix of views that would surprise their friends and neighbors. But we've created this culture where one wrong opinion can define you completely. Alexandra found herself nodding. That's true. I've certainly felt pressure to stay in my lane, to not question certain positions publicly. The admission surprised even her. The control room was probably having a fit, but something about James's straightforward manner made it easy to be honest. That pressure cuts both ways, James said. Left and right. We're all afraid of saying the wrong thing, of being cast out. That fear doesn't lead to progress. It leads to silence or performance. Neither is healthy. A young man in the front row raised his hand hesitantly. This wasn't the usual format for the evening spotlight, but Alexandra, sensing the unusual energy in the room, nodded to him. I just wanted to say, the young man said, his voice slightly shaky. My grandpa loves your movies and he and I disagree on almost everything politically. But watching this conversation, I don't know, it makes me think maybe I should listen to him more instead of just arguing. Several audience members murmured in agreement. James smiled at the young man. That might be the nicest thing anyone said about my work in years, he replied, prompting gentle laughter from the audience. And your grandpa should listen to you too. Both generations have wisdom to offer. Alexandra watched as something remarkable happened in her studio. The atmosphere had completely transformed from tense expectation to thoughtful engagement. People were nodding, exchanging glances, actually thinking instead of just reacting. You've directed over 30 films, she said, moving the conversation forward, but maintaining the authentic tone. What changes have you seen in Hollywood that concern you the most? James considered the question. The business side has changed dramatically. When I started, studios took more risks. A film could start slow and build an audience through word of mouth. Now, if you don't have a massive opening weekend, you're finished. That leads to safer choices, more sequels and remakes. And what about the social changes? Alexandra pressed gently. The push for more diversity both on and off camera? Long overdue, James replied without hesitation. Some of the most talented people I've worked with in recent years are women and people of color, who probably wouldn't have gotten the same opportunities when I was starting out. My issue has never been with inclusion. It's with the performative nature of how some studios approach it. He shifted in his chair, his eyes showing a flash of the intensity that had made him famous in his action roles. True diversity isn't just about checking boxes for a press release. It's about actually valuing different perspectives and experiences, letting those voices tell their authentic stories. Alexandra was surprised to find herself agreeing with him. That's actually a very progressive position, James chuckled. See, that's what I mean about labels. Because I've criticized certain approaches, people assume I'm against the entire concept. Life's more complicated than that. The floor director was signaling that they had 5 minutes left in the segment. Alexandra realized with a start that she had completely abandoned her prepared questions. This had become a real conversation. "Your film opens next week," she said. "What do you hope audiences take away from it?" "I hope they see themselves in these characters regardless of their politics or background," James replied. "I hope they recognize that most people are doing their best with the information they have. And maybe, just maybe, I hope it makes them curious about people they've written off as the other side." Alexandra nodded thoughtfully. "That's a message that resonates more than I expected it would." The honesty in her voice was unmistakable. James gave her a small nod of recognition, one professional to another. As the segment drew to a close, Alexandra realized something remarkable had happened. What had begun as an attempted ambush had transformed into one of the most genuine exchanges in the show's history. No viral gotcha moments, no angry storming off stage. Just two people from different generations and perspectives actually talking to each other. And somehow that had become the most compelling television of all. Continue his unexpected response. "One last question before we wrap up," Alexandra said, glancing at the clock. They were running slightly over time, but the director in her earpiece wasn't rushing her to conclude. The network executives were probably watching the social media numbers climb and decided to let this unusual segment continue. "Your career spans 6 decades, she continued. "You've seen cultural shifts, technological revolutions, and major political changes. What's the most important lesson you've learned that you wish you could tell your younger self?" James took a moment to consider the question. The studio was completely silent. Even the camera operators seemed to be holding their breath. "I'd tell myself to listen more," he finally said, his voice carrying a weight of experience. "I was stubborn when I was young. Thought I had all the answers. I missed out on learning from some incredible people because I was too busy trying to prove I was right." He looked out at the audience, making eye contact with several people in the front rows. "I'd also tell myself that most of the things I worried about weren't worth the energy. The career setbacks, the bad reviews, the industry politics. None of that matters in the end. What matters are the people you connect with, the stories you tell that touch someone's heart." A woman in the audience wiped away a tear. James noticed and gave her a gentle nod. "And I'd tell myself to be kinder," he added. "Not just to others, but to myself too. We're all just trying to figure this life out as we go along." Alexandra was surprised to feel a lump forming in her throat. This wasn't the James Wilson that media reports had portrayed, the gruff, cantankerous Hollywood icon who growled at reporters and gave blunt, controversial statements. This was a man reflecting honestly on a long life, sharing wisdom without preaching. "That's beautiful," she said softly, momentarily forgetting her role as the sharp-tongued host. "I think those are lessons we could all benefit from, regardless of generation." James smiled, a real smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "That's the thing about wisdom, isn't it? The truly valuable lessons never go out of style." "We're almost out of time," Alexandra said, "but there's something I'm curious about. Throughout your career, you've been known for keeping your private life private. You rarely give interviews, and when you do, they're usually focused strictly on your work. Why did you agree to come on this show? You must have known it wouldn't be an easy conversation." The question wasn't in her prepared notes. It was genuine curiosity, human to human. James leaned back slightly in his chair. "The easy answer is that my publicist insisted," he said with a slight chuckle that prompted warm laughter from the audience. "But the truth is, I've been thinking a lot lately about the state of our national conversation. I'm in my 80s now. I don't have that many more films left to make, that many more stories to tell." He gestured around the studio. "The shouting matches on TV, the social media pile-ons, the refusal to see humanity in people we disagree with, it breaks my heart. I thought maybe, just maybe, having a real conversation might remind people what that looks like." A murmur of appreciation rippled through the audience. Alexandra felt something shift inside her, a recognition that she had been part of the problem she claimed to be solving. "In your new film," she said, There's a powerful scene where two characters with opposing worldviews finally have a breakthrough moment of understanding. Was that based on a real experience? James's eyes lit up at the reference. It was clear she had actually watched his film, despite her earlier approach suggesting otherwise. Yes, actually, he said, sitting up straighter. About 15 years ago, I was directing a film in a small town in Montana. There was a local man who was furious that our production was there, thought we were going to portray his community negatively. He protested every day, made life difficult for the crew. James smiled at the memory. Instead of having him removed, which I could have done, I invited him to lunch. We sat for 3 hours in a local diner. He told me about his family going back 5 generations in that town, about his fears of seeing their way of life mocked by Hollywood. I told him about my vision for the film, which was actually a love letter to small-town America. Did you change his mind? Alexandra asked. Better than that, James replied. He ended up as an advisor on the film. Some of the most authentic details came from his suggestions. We're still friends to this day. He sends me May-made jerky every Christmas. The audience laughed warmly. It was a perfect anecdote, human, specific, and illustrating his point without hammering it. That's what's missing from our public discourse, James continued. The willingness to sit down with someone you disagree with and just listen. Not waiting for your turn to speak, not thinking about how to counter their points, but truly listening with an open heart. Alexandra nodded slowly. I think you've demonstrated that tonight. This conversation has gone in a very different direction than I expected, and I mean that in the best possible way. She turned toward the camera for her closing remarks, but then paused and turned back to James. Actually, before we wrap up, I want to say something off script. The floor director's eyes widened, and Alexandra could hear frantic discussion in her earpiece, but she removed it and set it on the small table beside her chair. When you first walked out here tonight, she said directly to James, I had an agenda. I'd researched your most controversial statements, prepared questions designed to provoke a reaction. I was looking for a viral moment at your expense. The studio was deadly quiet. No one had ever heard Alexandra Reed admit something like this on air, but what I got instead was a lesson in genuine dialogue, she continued. You didn't take the bait. You didn't get defensive or angry. You spoke thoughtfully and treated me with respect, even when my questions didn't deserve it. James seemed momentarily taken aback by her candor, but his expression softened into appreciation. Thank you for that, Alexandra said. In a media landscape that rewards conflict and outrage, you've reminded me why I got into journalism in the first place. To understand different perspectives, not just to reinforce what I already believe. The audience broke into spontaneous applause. It wasn't the polite, prompted applause of a talk show. It was genuine appreciation for the unexpected authenticity they had witnessed. James reached across the space between their chairs and offered his hand. Alexandra took it, a simple human connection that somehow felt more significant than the verbal sparring they might have engaged in. Now I really am out of time, Alexandra said, turning back to the camera with a smile that felt more genuine than any she'd given on air in years. I want to thank James Wilson for joining us tonight, and for the most unexpected and valuable conversation we've had on this show in a long time. His new film, American Heartland, opens in theaters nationwide next Friday. She turned back to James. And I hope you'll consider coming back sometime. I promise a real conversation from the start next time. James nodded, his eyes twinkling. I'd like that. As the theme music swelled and the credits began to roll, the audience rose to their feet in a standing ovation. It wasn't just for James Wilson, the Hollywood legend. It was for what they had all just experienced together, a moment of genuine, human connection in a media landscape starved for authenticity. In the control room, producers were already discussing how to promote clips from the interview. But for once, they weren't looking for the most controversial sound bites. They were identifying the moments of wisdom, the exchanges that had resonated most deeply with viewers. Alexandra sat in her chair as the audience continued applauding, feeling both humbled and strangely liberated. She had built her career on crafting confrontational moments, on reinforcing her viewers' existing beliefs. Tonight, almost by accident, she had helped create something different, something that reminded everyone, herself included, of what television could be at its best. And James Wilson at 82 had delivered perhaps his most important performance yet, not with prepared lines or careful editing, but with simple honesty and the hard-earned wisdom of a life fully lived. The lights in the studio dimmed as the evening spotlight logo flashed across the screens. The audience filed out slowly, many lingering in small groups, engaged in animated conversations about what they had just witnessed. It wasn't the explosive confrontation they had expected, but something far more rare and valuable. Backstage, James Wilson sat in his dressing room, loosening his tie and taking a deep breath. His phone buzzed continuously on the small table. Messages from his publicist, his agent, his children, and friends who had watched the broadcast. He ignored them all for now, needing a moment of quiet after the intensity of the past hour. A soft knock came at the door. "Come in," he called, expecting the production assistant who had escorted him earlier. Instead, Alexandra Reed stood in the doorway, her professional mask completely gone. She looked younger somehow, more vulnerable without the armor of her public persona. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said hesitantly. James gestured to the small sofa opposite his chair. "Not at all. Please sit." Alexandra closed the door behind her and sat down, smoothing her red dress nervously. "I wanted to thank you. Privately, I mean. What happened out there?" She paused, searching for words. It wasn't just good television. It was important. James studied her face. The sharp edges of her on-camera personality had softened. "You seem surprised by your own honesty at the end." She laughed softly. "That makes two of us. My producer is probably drafting my termination letter as we speak." "I doubt that," James replied. The audience response was genuine. People are hungry for real conversations. Alexandra nodded, glancing down at her phone. "Social media is exploding. The clips are already going viral, but not in the way we expected. People are calling it the most honest moment on television in years." She looked up at him. "My inbox is flooded with messages from viewers thanking us for not shouting at each other." "That's a sad commentary on the state of our discourse, isn't it?" James said. "When a simple conversation between two people with different perspectives is seen as revolutionary." "My director wants to know if you'd consider a regular segment," Alexandra said with a small smile. "We could call it Conversations with James or something." The old actor chuckled. "I think that would defeat the purpose. What happened tonight was authentic because it wasn't planned. Turn it into a regular feature and it becomes just another performance." She nodded, understanding. "You're right. But I do want to approach my show differently going forward. Less gotcha moments, more real dialogue. Would you be willing to give me some advice occasionally? Off the record, just one professional to another." James considered her request. "I'd be happy to. As long as you understand I don't have all the answers. I'm still figuring things out myself, even at my age." A comfortable silence fell between them. Outside, they could hear the bustle of the crew breaking down the set, the normal post-show activity returning to the studio. "How are you getting to your hotel?" Alexandra asked suddenly. "The press will be waiting outside by now. Tonight's broadcast has everyone talking." James shrugged. "My driver's supposed to meet me at the back entrance. I'm used to dealing with the press." "Actually," Alexandra said, "there's a small restaurant about 3 blocks from here. Family-owned Italian place, been there for decades. The food is amazing, and they have a private room in the back where no one will bother you. If you'd like. To grab a real dinner instead of room service, I'd be happy to show you the way. We can go through the service exit, no press there." The invitation surprised him. It wasn't networking or professional courtesy, it was simply human connection. James smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't expected from this evening. "I'd like that," he said. "Just let me call my driver to let him know." 30 minutes later, they sat in a cozy, wood-paneled room at the back of a small restaurant called Giuseppe's. The owner, an elderly man with a thick Italian accent, had recognized James immediately and greeted him like royalty, insisting on bringing out his best wine and personally preparing their meals. "You come here often?" James asked as Alexandra took a sip of the rich red wine. She nodded. "It's my hiding place. When the persona gets too heavy to carry, I come here and just be myself for a while." "That sounds familiar," James said. "I have a small cabin up in Montana. No cell service, no internet, just mountains and silence. It's where I go to remember who I am beyond the roles in the public image." "Must be nice," Alexandra said, a hint of wistfulness in her voice. "To be able to just disappear like that." "It took me a long time to learn how important it was," James replied. "When I was younger, I was consumed by the work, by what people thought of me. It nearly destroyed me in my 40s. The drinking, the failed marriages, the constant pressure to maintain the image." Alexandra looked surprised. "I didn't know about that part of your life. It's not in any of the biographies. I've been careful about what makes it into the public record," James said with a small smile. "But yes, I had my dark years. What saved me was remembering why I wanted to tell stories in the first place, to connect people, to help them see the world through different eyes." Their conversation flowed easily as the food arrived. Handmade pasta, fresh bread, and a sauce that had been simmering all day. They talked about their childhoods, their early career struggles, their favorite books and films. Politics came up occasionally, but without the performative disagreement that characterized public discourse. They discovered areas of common ground and respectfully explored their differences. By the time they finished their tiramisu and espresso, 3 hours had passed. The restaurant had emptied except for the owner and his wife, who were quietly cleaning up, giving their special guests all the time they needed. "I should probably let you get back to your hotel," Alexandra said, glancing at her watch. "You must be exhausted." James nodded, but there was a contentment in his expression that hadn't been there earlier. This was much better than room service and CNN. "Thank you." As they waited for their separate cars outside the restaurant's back entrance, Alexandra turned to him. "Can I ask you something? Something that's been bothering me since the interview?" "Of course. You knew, didn't you? You knew what I was planning to do tonight. That's why you were so prepared, so calm when I tried to corner you." James looked up at the night sky, the few stars visible through the city lights. "I had a pretty good idea. It wasn't my first rodeo, as they say." "So why agree to it?" she pressed. "Why put yourself in that position?" He turned to look at her directly. "Because sometimes the only way to change a conversation is to join it. I could have stayed in my bubble, given interviews only to friendly outlets, preached to the choir. But what good would that do?" Alexandra considered his words. "Most people in your position wouldn't take that risk. Most people haven't lived long enough to see what happens when we stop talking to each other." James replied. "I have. It never ends well." A black car pulled up to the curb, James's ride. The driver stepped out and opened the back door. "My film opens next Friday," James said as he prepared to leave. "There's a small premiere here in the city. Nothing flashy, just a screening and a simple reception after. Would you like to come? As my guest, not as press." Alexandra smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "I'd be honored." They shook hands, but it was more than a professional gesture now. It was a symbol of the bridge they had built tonight. Not just between two individuals, but between different ways of engaging with the world. "Good night, Alexandra," James said, sliding into the back seat of his car. "And thank you for the most unexpected interview of my career." "Good night, James," she replied. "Thank you for reminding me what journalism is supposed to be about." As his car pulled away, Alexandra stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, watching it disappear into the city traffic. Her phone buzzed with notifications, emails from network executives, messages from colleagues, social media alerts about the interview that was now trending nationwide. For once, she didn't feel the urgent need to check them all immediately. Instead, she took a deep breath of the night air and smiled to herself. In a career built on crafting narratives and controlling conversations, tonight she had experienced something rare and precious, a moment of genuine human connection that transcended all the labels and divisions. And in that moment, Both she and James Wilson had given their audience something far more valuable than entertainment. They had offered a glimpse of what might be possible if we all remembered how to really listen to each other again. Her own car arrived, and as she settled into the back seat, Alexandra made a decision. Tomorrow's show would be different, and maybe, just maybe, that difference would ripple outward, changing more conversations than just her own. "Where to, Ms. Reed?" her driver asked. "Home," she said simply. "It's been quite a night."